Welcome, everyone. Today we have a very interesting conversation really centered around diversity, equity, inclusion. But before we get to that, I want to introduce the person who will be having a conversation with me personally, and that's Eric Sarver, Manhattan-based employment law and business law attorney who counsels, defends, represents small to mid-sized businesses in employment law and business law matters spanning various industries. A Long Island native who went to SUNY Binghamton and Hofstra Law School. Eric began practicing law back in January 1999, and he's a founding attorney of Sarver Law Firm PLLC, which opened its doors in April of 2001. Eric and his associates help small to mid-sized companies seeking to navigate ever-changing world of federal, state, and municipal law and employment laws while defending employers' management in federal and state courts, arbitration, or in government investigations into matters such as employment discrimination, wage and hour violations, paid leave issues, breach of employment contract, or commission disputes and related employment litigation and compliance matters. Welcome, Eric.
Oh, thank you, Simone. It's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, today we're going to talk about diversity and equity inclusion. And I know it's a topic that is like a hot thing right now and has evolved over time in terms of the conversation today. And so where I want to start off, just so that way we are kind of defining it on this show in terms of and a nomenclature of how we're going to be talking about it, is to one, define it, right? What is it? What is it?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think it's important to start from there, right? From that perspective. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'll definitely chime in with mine.
Yeah, sure thing, Simone. And definitely a very hot and very important topic too, especially in the employment realm, but also in educational settings, in accommodations, public facing accommodations. So I maybe start with a basic definition, right? Because you hear people on both sides, people are praising DEI or trashing it. So like, what is it that you're praising or trashing, right? And it's basically the way I define DEI, which again stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Let's say it's a set of practices and policies that promote fair treatment and really promote participation, right, for all people, aiming to create a welcoming and respectful workplace, if we're looking at it in the work point of view, where employees, can feel valued and included. So what it really, the goal of the DEI is to expand opportunities in the workplace, right, to better enhance and enrich the talent pool, offering different perspectives, and to promote equity and fairness in hiring, in promotion, and opportunities. That's really how I see DEI, best way to define it.
Absolutely. Listen, we live in a world where we're filled with so many differences, right? And when we think about diversity, it's all the characteristics of who we are. And there's so many intersectionalities in terms of how we identify and how it overlaps in the Venn diagram that goes along with it. And
Mhm.
then when we look at the word equity, right? Because they all stand individually, but they collectively
Mm.
are very powerful. Because equity is not just equally ensuring access, but it's
Right.
addressing those unique needs, right? That need to be addressed in order to allow to have that access. And then you
Right.
also talk about inclusion, another powerful word, right? But people
Mhm.
also, in that same vein, want to have a sense of feeling welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. And so I think it's
Mhm.
important to understand that these words stand individually, collectively are very powerful in how they work to move and to have people feel, everyone feel included.
I think it's a great point, Simone. And your point on equity, I think, is really worth emphasizing. Equity doesn't always necessarily mean equal, right? An equal chance. I mean, if you look at very kind of very just brief example that comes to mind for me, if you have two doors open for two different employees, each door is the same width, each door has three steps up to the door, right? You'd say, hey, the access for both employees is equal. They both have to walk three steps, right? But if one of those employees is in a wheelchair and the other is able-bodied and walking, that's equal but not
Absolutely.
equity, right? Equitable would be put a ramp to the employee with the wheelchair, and so that each has a fair chance to get into the building, right? That's just what
Absolutely.
comes to mind for when people say, we want, everyone's the same. We don't see color, we don't see gender.
Right,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think it's fair then because so many other people on the other coin, on the other side of that coin, have so many misconceptions about what DEI is. And they don't even know that DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion, right? First of all. but they've got this is what they've been told or what they think and judgments and assumptions around it that have really clouded what this really means for everyone, right? And
Hmm.
so when you think about what it's not, and we can ramble off
Mm.
a multitude of things, right? It is not about quotas and it's not about
Mm.
lowering standards, right?
Right. Yes.
It's not about reverse discrimination, meaning
Right.
preferential treatment for others versus not. It is not about focusing on identity over merit.
Right.
There is not a one size fit all solution for this.
Hmm.
It is not a check the box initiative, right? Because I saw a lot of things in
Hmm.
the paper saying, oh, it didn't really have effect. If you're checking a box, it's not going to have an effect.
Right.
It's not a luxury to have, given where the
Mm.
demographics are going within the United States and around the world.
Hmm.
It is not focusing, diversity of thought is very important, but diversity of identity also has to be included because people need to be valued in terms of what they're bringing to the table and how and their approach to bringing it to the table. And I really want to emphasize this too, it's that it's not a replacement for meritocracy.
Right.
It's not replacing that at all. And should not even be in the conversation with diversity, equity, inclusion. And it's not something that's static, meaning it's not a goal,
Mm. Yeah.
right? It's a journey, it's a process. You're talking about people
Mhm.
evolving, markets, businesses. So you have to think about it from that perspective. Your thoughts, Eric?
First thoughts are 100%, nodding along. I know we're on audio, but you can't see me nodding, but right. Well, a couple of quick thoughts. First off, Simone, thank you for that. I think it's very important when we're defining something. If there are misconceptions about what it is, let's get those out of the way, right? Like you said, what it's not. So I think that one of the big flaws is that the flawed premise, perhaps, right, is like the idea that there's this either or between having the best person win, the merit-based approach, or the DEI approach. And the implication there is that if you have diversity, equity, inclusion, you are therefore substandard, that you're sacrificing merit. And the truth, actually, which I think we know, just from statistics, right, from studies, from anecdotal experience, people, is that actually, to be a person of color, to be a woman of color, especially a transgender person in this country, right, to get ahead, often have to work 20 times harder and be 20 times more qualified, right? And they often have fewer, ins from legacy and from nepotism and connections.
That's just to get to the seat at the table. That's not even
Right,
just to be invited. Go
right.
ahead.
And then another point you made, and I think my employer law, employment law cap on, I say, right, that the more diverse people you have, right, especially in upper ranks of management, the better chance that the environment will not be discriminatory, and the better chance that there won't be as many explicit or implicit forms of racism and aggression. And that could help in terms of, again, keeping my employment law hat on, right? Maybe minimizing risk of litigation. If the entire management staff, the whole team, you know, looks like me. I mean, if white, straight, male, able-bodied, heterosexual, right? And there's no one else at the table, there's a greater chance that perhaps people, individuality won't be respected, people won't feel safe, sharing their views. So, and then the final point you made about, the diversity having a good experience, looking outward, companies have to recognize that their consumers, their clients, or their customers don't all look one way, right? And so having diverse views can help to say, hey, this is what our customers want in terms of product or services.
Absolutely. And I
Hmm.
think it's and as part of that too, is looking at how it's kind of evolved because DEI has diversity, equity, inclusion has evolved over the years.
Hmm.
Companies, organizations, however, may not be as evolved, right? And they're
Hmm.
still maybe operating in certain paradigms that perpetuate these
Hmm.
misconceptions
Sure.
or more evolved views of what it is. And so when you think about it from, I call it DEI 101 where that's where you are heavily compliance driven initiatives, right? And you're trying to raise the awareness of what differences are. And if you're in that type of organization, you're really at the beginning levels, right? And not even scratching the surface of what you could potentially be doing to evolve your culture. Then you have
Hmm.
the 1.0, DEI 1.0, where it's really what you're doing here is highlighting those differences and showing the value of why the
Hmm.
differences come together in overall business. But where you find companies too
Hmm.
where are very evolved, I call it 3.0. Why?
Hmm.
Talking about embedding DEI into a business strategy, right? That means
Hmm.
there's sustainability around this, and it's integrated into the business, into the culture. And it's very interesting with the work that I've done with cultures and organizations and diversity and inclusion. You find so many varying levels of where
Hmm.
are, and they don't even realize where they are, but they want to jump to that goal, right, of what
Right.
it's like to be without doing the work that's necessary
Hmm.
from that. And so when we think about evolution, right,
Hmm.
current state comes into play. And you have
Yes.
employers, and I don't know if this list is still accurate or not. It could change.
Hmm. Yes.
Just in terms of companies who have commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and have come out and talked about it, like the Apples of the world, the
Yes.
Cisco's, the Costco's, Delta, right? More Microsoft, NASDAQ, in their
Hmm.
ways. And but what
Hmm.
intrigues me most is their rationale for this. They've mentioned things like it's in their culture, it's embedded. It's in
Hmm.
part of their corporate strategy or business strategy. It's
Hmm.
part of their values, business values.
Hmm.
They think about talent and how do we retain and attract the best talent because they understand the communities in which they serve are very diverse, right? From
Hmm.
that perspective. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, first, I think one thought is that, I think people need, right, folks like people that are, not only executive business coaches, but DEI and diversity consultants who can help the companies get to that, for example, that, right, 2.0 or 3.0 version of diversity where it's embedded and baked into the culture. I do think that right now, the trends we're seeing, obviously, in the last 2 months, sometimes it feels like 2 years have gone by, but it's just right, say everything are very disturbing, almost, right, say, or not almost, like, just frankly going backwards, in progress, because I think that, I think for years, the trends have been right to celebrate and promote DEI in a few areas, right, in the federal government, both in federal hiring and promotion, but also just the federal government saying to private businesses, look, you might want to do this because it's the right thing to do. But if that's not your motivation, if you want to get government contracts, you have to demonstrate, right, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI initiatives in your hiring practices. Now it's the flip and the opposite, right? That if you have that DEI, you won't get those government contracts, or that's the threat, right, of this
Right.
new executive order. Right, but I think that companies recognize from there are different points of view, the HR perspective, right, the business perspective, and the employment law perspective. I like to put on multiple hats, but I feel like you're wearing the hat to say, hey, listen, this helps increase employee morale. It helps to diversify the customer and client experience. Because again, if you don't want to make a tone deaf commercial that misses half your market, right, then you might want to look into DI initiatives. If you don't want to alienate valuable candidates, and we're seeing a lot of Gen Z and younger millennials, right, really value social justice in their lives. So the more you hire, the more you retain positive talent that's what's the opposite of demoralized? That's incentivized, that's
Right.
encouraged. I almost said moralized, but that's incentivized, right? Just kind of, I guess maybe a quick employment law point of view is that I think for employers, I've told employers over the years, right, that if you're accused of employment discrimination by an ex-employee, maybe it's a disgruntled worker, and you say, hey, this is not true, this is just the person misunderstood, or they're disgruntled and making this up. I look to part of the courts look to this also, and the EEOC used to look to this, and the New York State Division of Human Rights used to look to this. When I say this, what is this? They used to look to, right, the presence of DEI initiatives and policies, because we could say as part of our defense, hey, listen, this company is not discriminatory. Quite the opposite. They celebrate racial differences. Look, they have DEI initiatives, they have anti-harassment trainings, they have a diversity, equity, inclusion hiring platform in place. So, when companies don't have that, a lot of times they get sort of they're looked at askew, askance by, a jury or state division of human rights is like, we don't have any of these equity, any DEI initiatives at all. And and you say you value racial, harmony and inclusion, we don't buy it. So it could actually strengthen an ex-employee's case against you. And
Mm,
the irony that now you can be in trouble sometimes with the federal government, or so they're saying, for having DEI, but if you don't have it, and then on the state level, or if you go to the New York City Commission of Human Rights to defend a claim, it can hurt you. Employers are between a rock and a hard place.
absolutely. And it gets very tricky because then also find that folks who are moving forward and double downing, like in terms of their organizations and
Mhm.
continuing this, have embedded it in their culture. So it's not something that it was some empty platitude, or they jumped on a bandwagon and started and signed some petitions and made a statement around it. It
Right.
makes it easy to kind of unpluck that and undo that because there was nothing there substance to begin with, right? But for those that feel kind of stuck in terms of how to best mobilize this, and I come from that compliance background, and I think about mitigating risk and things of that nature in this environment. What are you kind of advising organizations to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because, and again, just to frame it for our audience from the employment law right perspective, for those that may not know, in January, actually, it was January 21st of this year, Executive Order 14173, if you're curious to look it up, right, was passed by the administration, and it basically ordered to sort of rooted out, right, deactivated DEI initiatives in the federal government and federal hiring. We're going to deem these to be illegal activities. And then it also went further to say that the government would look to prosecute companies that have DEI initiatives. This was illegal, and they would use enforcement divisions and agencies such as the EEOC, right, which they replaced the chair and basically restructure the organization. So they're calling DEI so-called reverse discrimination, which we know it's not, but so they're going after people with that. They're also threatening to withhold certain federal grants. Or, for example, if you have a company that, COVID 26 hits, God forbid, and you apply for emergency assistance from the Small Business Administration, it'd be denied. So there are issues of compliance, threats of lawsuits, penalties, and fines. So what do I advise my clients, right? Some of them call me up, employers, they say, well, I guess we have to deactivate our DEI. And I say, not so fast. Because again, you might open yourself up to discrimination suits at this, state level, or before the New York City Commission of Human Rights, or in New Jersey, right?
Absolutely.
Like so what I can recommend that they do, Simone, is the following, right? I say, let's go through for now your employee handbook, right? Maybe make your website, and let's like look for the words that the administration or their enforcement agencies, like the EOC or the Office of Civil Rights, I can hardly believe that these organizations are now being used to root out DEI. These are the ones that used to enforce, right,
Yeah,
anti-discrimination measures. But what I would say is, maybe we just take out some of the words they might be looking for and replace the words, but keep the concepts in place. So, we can call, as we said when this podcast started, we said meritocracy and DEI are not right opposite words. They're not in opposite of each other. They actually coexist. So, call it your merit-based hiring program. And if you do that, actually, if you truly hire on merit, you're actually going to open up the hiring to include more
absolutely.
people of color, more
Absolutely.
disabled folks, more people that are gay and bisexual. So, you could have all the right wording, but to call it the merit-based, don't call it DEI, call it MBH, merit-based hiring, call it BLT, bacon, lettuce, tomato program. Who cares what you like initials, right? But just get
Right. But the
then have
intentions have
understanding.
to be there. The intentions in terms of if you're truly um, um, into an inclusive environment and want a diverse environment, those intentions would come through and forth in terms of the actions. And I strongly believe, but you have to not stop talking about, continue discussing the importance
Mhm.
of why this is important for the organization, for the culture, for innovation, and all those other things to enable you to be, use the word sustainable. I know that word was X'd
Mhm.
out when they come about sustainability. But you have
Yeah.
two states too that are very interesting. One of
Yes.
which is Michigan, and they're
Yes.
trying to abandon their diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and they talk about it in public schools yet,
Right.
right? From that perspective. So tell me a little bit about what you see there, because then let's hold off a little bit. Maine. is also facing challenges, but they've also confronted, right, the governor, the federal government in terms of what their stances are for diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'd love from a legal perspective to get your insights on that.
Absolutely, Simone. Well, first, I was kind of briefly say, right to a good point you made about DEI, from the sustainability standpoint, right? That again, if you want to mitigate and reduce the risk of litigation from your employees, if you want to minimize the risk of implicit discrimination happening and bias in your workforce, which could lead to lawsuits again, I think that having understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, having initiatives is key. I think it's about renaming right now and rewording the language that anyone could be examining on your website, your employee handbook, and your outgoing, initiatives. But have the people who are hiring understand that we're going to hire widely and broadly and diversely, and we're going to promote that way as well. To taking your question about Maine, let's say, right, and Michigan, yes, two interesting states. So I guess right with Michigan, they're basically saying, right, that we're not going to, take a knee. The Trump administration is threatening to pull their funding, the federal funding, right, under Title VI, has to do with discrimination in schools, for teaching DEI, for incorporating it into the educational agenda or programs. And this, right, basically now Michigan's saying, no, we're not going to change, right, our educational, policies and objectives. We're not going to take out, teaching of, race theory and racism or teaching about LGBTQ history. So they're basically not informing, and they're saying that it's in the state's rights to determine their educational programs, and they're challenging, pushing back, right? And then I think right in terms of Maine, in a similar vein, right, the Maine governor basically told our current president, we'll see you in court, because right, they're not going to change their policies around transgender athletes in sports in certain right
Right.
educational settings.
Absolutely. So it's going to be interesting to watch, I think, those two states as we kind of evolve what this administration decides to do or not do and how other states
Mhm.
react and respond. And I think most folks are in a wait and see kind of a mode from that
Yes.
perspective. But, when you think about it from a broader perspective, there's a whole idea around innovation and business success. And workplaces
Yes.
are being redefined and transformed in shifts with technology, talent, and
Mhm.
expectations around the work. And so
Mhm.
competition and innovation, right, are now kind of collapsed
Mhm.
because in
Yes.
order for these things to to thrive and to excel upon, you need inclusive cultural workplaces more than ever. And how
Right.
those things evolve in a multitudes is not only how we kind of embed, and the work that we do is to embed it in your strategy. So you kind they're not two separable things. Your people strategy has to be embedded in your business strategy in order to be able to move and be more competitive, right? But also
Mhm.
too, as we are evolving and it's things are going so quickly,
Mhm.
upskilling is becomes important. Looking at your where your what your leaders, managers, your people, your employees in terms of their skills have today and where you're trying to go tomorrow, there are huge gaps that need to be addressed. And if you're not thinking about how to improve and upskill your employees, you're going to be left behind. Also,
Mhm.
right? And then also
Yes.
thinking about too, just in terms of how you use technology. Folks are
Mhm.
frightened about AI and is it going to replace me? But how do you
Right.
start integrating that? Because if you don't use it, you're going to be left behind. But if you don't up
Right.
your folks to understand how to use it effectively to move your business forward, you're going to be left behind. And then thinking about too, just in terms of, COVID, and we talked about that a little bit as well, where
Mhm.
you had the frontline workers and then you had
Mhm.
corporate, right, workers, and they were
Yes.
treated so differently. Guess what? That's
Mhm.
inclusion as well, because they felt
Right.
marginalized as they were on the front lines, had to go into work every day, right? And while corporate could work from home. And there's a
Right.
mismatch in terms of policies and how people were being treated during that time. Then think about too
Mhm.
benefit for women, right?
Right.
I was looking at the McKinsey study for women in the workplace, and
Mhm.
they're looking at how do we start integrating benefits that address women's needs. around menopause, caregiving, all
Mm.
of these things, right? And if that's not part of the conversation moving forward, we're 50% of the population, last time I checked, women, right?
Yep. Sounds about right. Mhm.
What's going to happen there? That's also inclusion. And then tackling ageism on both scales, 5 generations in a
Right.
place. There are a lot of things here that you cannot just say it doesn't matter. All of these things matter, right? And I'd love
And
to
all
get
these things are DEI, right? They're all under the umbrella of DEI. I think
absolutely.
people don't realize that as well. Everything you're saying, Simone, it's really fascinating to me, right? Because as you know, I'm an employment law, business law attorney, right? So I help my clients, small and mid-sized businesses, companies, nonprofits as well, right? With I think everything from compliance, following all the federal, state, and city laws to defending them. What happens when they get a New York State Department of Labor, a New Jersey Department of Labor notice, a whole audit, a hearing, investigation, right? Or a lawsuit, or helping them with like compliance, right? I do all that for them. So I'm always thinking about things like litigation risk, right? Minimizing risk of litigation, minimizing risk of fines and penalties. But it's to be successful, right? There's more than just avoiding harm. You think about your health as a person, right? I mean, it's great, right, to have a doctor that tests you to make sure that you don't have cancer, you don't have a condition, you don't have kidney disease. That's great. But you also need help with building a positive, healthy lifestyle, right? What are you doing to strengthen your muscles and muscle tone, to lose weight, to have good exercise and nutrition? So, there's sort of multiple parts to making a person
Absolutely.
healthy. And I think there's multiple fronts and parts to making a business healthy, right? So I always like tell my clients, yeah, there's the employment law side of things of what you are and are not allowed to do or what you should and should not do. There's also good business practice. And those two, more often than not, those two things, business practice, to enhance employee morale, to improve customer service, client service, and employment law compliance go hand in hand and they feed into each other in a positive, synergistic way. They don't clash. It's not an either or, right? So,
Right.
quick example, even non-DI related, sometimes I'll have clients will ask me, some clients will say, all right, Eric, my employment law compliance attorney here. What's the minimum amount, the least amount of sick days that I have to pay my employees in New Jersey or New York State? What's the least I need to do under the law? And I'll say, well, okay, legally speaking, you need New York State paid sick leave and New York City paid sick leave, and you need this many days off. I'll say, that's all the minimum. But if I put on my business promotion hat for a minute, if you want to have happy, well-adjusted employees with high morale and less burnout who don't quit and need to be replaced, and you'll give them more than the bare minimum. So it's like I'm advising from a business point of view. So I feel like in DEI, like we said, diversify hiring, increase your chance of getting more talent. If you look at hiring 50, 60 years ago, it was often people hired because their uncle worked at a company or their aunt or their grandfather, or they were legacy from a certain school. And that promotes a very tunnel vision view of the world and a view of your clients and your customers, right? And what they need and a view of what your fellow coworker wants and needs.
Absolutely. It does. And you raise a very interesting point because what came up for me is that you don't ignore your culture just because, right? If you truly believe in the people and you truly want to
Mhm.
empower them and help enable them to help your business,
Mhm.
you invest in your culture.
And you also, from an employment discrimination point of view, right, you recognize that equal doesn't always mean equitable, and there could be a disparate impact, in fact, that could lead to a lawsuit. So it's not enough just to say we have the exact same policy for male parents and female parents. When it comes to their bonuses, they work this many hours, they make it. If they take off for parental leave, the dads or the moms, they get penalized. Well, guess what? Who's going to take off more often a longer period? The
Absolutely.
mom, the woman that just gave birth, right, is physically recovering, is perhaps maybe nursing their child and taking 13 weeks off, 14 weeks off, or the dad. Some dads are taking that much time off, but a lot of dads taking 2 or 3 weeks off, right?
Right. Right.
Same thing with pregnancy, right? We know that women might need more time off to address when they're pregnant. I know that couples say, guess what? We are pregnant. But in actuality, the woman's body is the one that's carrying the baby, right?
Absolutely.
So it comes back to equity versus equality. Same thing with COVID. Parents working from home, who bears the brunt of child rearing in many family situations. So
Absolutely.
let's not always think that the same equals equitable.
Absolutely. And right. And I think too, from that perspective, it's really comes down to how are we including that conversation as part of our benefit package to be
Mm,
competitive in the workplace to get the best talent, right?
right.
So let's talk about some actionable, some strategies that we can take because we talk about the long-term economic value and
Mm,
workplace sustainability. And
yes.
when we look at diversity, equity, inclusion, it is still about building up that and owning really that consumer
Mm,
trust,
mm,
investment decisions, board governance, client relationships. All of these things are strategic advantage that enables innovation, enhances brand loyalty, and
mm,
secures long-term financial growth, right?
right.
As a lawyer and
Mm, yes.
and employment law, what
Yes.
practical steps would you ask or recommend to businesses in this current state?
I'm glad you added in this current state because if you and I were doing this podcast exactly 1 year ago this time, right, I would have said you want to increase your chance of getting government grants and funding. You want to increase your chance of getting other types of, right, say contracts and clients and say highlight and emphasize all the DEI language, hire DEI consultants. I will still say hire DEI consultants, such as yourself, for example, right? But I think that right now we're in this unique situation where we need to, right from a legal point of view, like I said a bit earlier, right? I'd say go back to your written policies, go back to your HR policies, your employee handbooks, go back to your websites and look for certain terms like diversity or equity, inclusion, and see if we can, let's get out the old thesaurus, right? Now there's online thesaurus. Let's look at different words we can use. So we say we're doing a merit-based hiring, merit-based promotion, which we are, because again, was never an issue, right? DEI was never instead of merit, as we talked about earlier. In fact, it actually highlighted merit and said, hey, you shouldn't be uh, excluded, even though you have all the skills, qualifications, abilities, simply because you're not white and male. So I think, right, we need to keep, but I think that behind the scenes, we're training our hiring managers to look for those diverse traits, to look to hire people of different nationalities, ethnicities, and backgrounds who are qualified, who have the abilities and skills. So I think we need to change the language for now so that if the government, the ELC, or other branch does come a knocking under the current administration, you can say, hey, I got all the language that, your people were touting. Look at this merit-based hiring program. Look at this, right, this, qualification-based promotion policy. So I think like the words need to be a little bit different right now in the outward facing documents and on your website, employee handbook, but it's almost like code speak. We're basically saying, but you're signaling to people and you're in the hiring, you're staying away from quotas, right? Staying away from hiring quotas, but we're making sure that we're hiring people that look as much like you as like me, right? And who can ever, challenge that if you're saying, hey, you were hired based on your strong background, your
Right,
education, your abilities, and so
absolutely. You know, it's interesting as you talk about that. I went to a conference, a wealth management conference a couple of weeks ago.
on.
And in the room, they were talking about this whole wealth transfer and how women, it's going to go to a lot of women and the fact that women in terms of that the monies that they have to manage and they need people to support them with managing. Of a room of 100 different companies, the facilitator had asked the room, how many of you have women on your staff?
Mm,
10%, if we're lucky, 10% raise their hands.
wow.
So if you're not even prepared to address that change and be
Mhm.
late to the customer base that's evolving, could you only
Right.
imagine, right? So I think it becomes very important to think about if you want, bias and discrimination as your norm and to go unchecked and remain a status quo, you're not going to, that stands a lot of risk as opposed to thinking about the future in terms of where businesses are evolving, where there is increased demand in terms of labor practices, global
Mhm.
expansion, AI
Mhm.
driven innovation. And in
Hmm.
order to continue to stay on top of all of these changes, you've got to
Hmm.
prioritize inclusion, accessibility, diverse talent pipelines. That way you can really ensure or mitigate the risk of you being able to thrive in years ahead, right? So I
Hmm.
leave the audience in terms of just thinking about practical steps that they can take to look at their culture, assess the culture. Where is it?
Hmm.
Look at your bench. What do you see?
Hmm.
What
Right.
skills and gaps are missing? What do you need to kind of
Hmm.
level up within? Because those are the things that are going to allow you to continue to be on top.
It's an economic and financial, what I'm hearing you say, Simone, right? An economic and financial and business incentive, right? Motivation to embrace DEI, to learn about it, to know what it is, to learn how to implement it with, as you just outlined, mentioned some concrete actionable steps. I think it's interesting. People can say, "Oh, I'd love to have DEI," but they don't know where to start. Someone might say, "I'd love to lose weight," but where do you start? Well, I'm gonna eat less calories and exercise more. Okay, but let's get a plan together. What kind of exercise? What kind of food plan? When do you eat carbs? When do you eat protein, right? You might need to hire a nutritionist or a weight loss coach or a trainer to really implement if and I think that businesses need to hire people like yourself to get those steps in place. And then, of course, where I come in as well is let's get you compliant with the federal, state, and municipal laws. And keep in mind that the executive order, I think one important point I didn't make earlier to make is that this executive order, right, is not the law of the land. It's being challenged in a federal court in Maryland. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has lifted a stay, but that's just a temporary step. That means the case will still go on. And Supreme Court has ruled about what certain federal laws against discrimination protect and what they don't. And there's certain federal and state laws out in the books. So an executive order does not supersede federal law or the Supreme Court's rulings on this topic. So I think it's important that clients and companies that want to thrive, like you said, but also don't want to risk lawsuits and other legal, penalties and fines. Really, it's in their best interest to continue ahead on the DEI path, and to watch the courts, watch what's happening, and that's where I come in. I'm revising employee handbooks these days, like three a week. I'm looking at external facing brochures and websites, and I'm making sure they're compliant, and I'm matching up the DOJ guidance, and so yeah, and I'm sure you're probably busy as well, helping clients in these
Absolutely.
matters. Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's going to be an interesting evolution and something to
Mhm.
really monitor because how we respond today informs
Yes,
what's going to be needed for the future.
right. Very true.
Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me on this very riveting conversation. More
Mm.
to come, and we definitely have to do a part two of this. So as things
Yes.
evolve, we're going to be on top of it. So thank you.
Simone, thank you so much for having me on your show today. Great conversation. I am equally riveted and looking forward to recording part two in the near future.